I never planned to get into a fight with my neighborhood HOA. Honestly, I just wanted to fish in peace. That's all I cared about. A quiet sunrise, a cup of coffee, the sound of the water gently lapping against the wooden pier. This was my retreat from the world. A little slice of calm in a life that hadn't always been smooth. You see, the pier wasn't just any pier. My grandfather built it decades ago. Back when this land was just marsh and trees and nobody cared about property lines or association rules. Back when neighbors helped each other instead of writing complaint letters. It was made from reclaimed wood and old nails, patched up over the years with care, but it stood strong. For me, it wasn't just a pirate, it was memory, legacy, and peace. So when I got a letter one morning from the HOA, I thought it was a mistake. The letter was cold, formal, full of legal words. It said the pier violated community waterfront guidelines. They claimed it extended too far, wasn't registered, and created aesthetic inconsistencies with the rest of the neighborhood. In short, they wanted it gone. I laughed at first. Surely they didn't mean my pier, the one that had been there longer than most of the homes around the lake. I called them, expecting a quick resolution. But the woman on the line didn't laugh. She said a new committee had reviewed shoreline structures and decided my pier needed to be removed. They'd give me 30 days. That was it, 30 days to erase history. To tear down the very place where I taught my daughter how to bait a hook, where my father used to sit with a book in one hand and a rod in the other. 30 days to destroy the place where I went to think when my wife passed. No, that wasn't going to happen. I showed up at the next HOA meeting. I wasn't angry yet, just confused. I brought photos, permits, a folder full of documents going back 30 years. I explained the history of the pier, its construction, its maintenance, and how it posed no threat to safety or aesthetics. I showed them letters from my neighbors saying they liked it, that they fished there too sometimes. But the board didn't care. One-man chairman of the HOA looked me in the eye and said, "Rules are rules," just like that. No room for conversation, no compromise. Just a cold shrug and a gavel. So I fought. I filed appeals. I sent letters. I even got a local historian to back me up, showing that the pier was a historical structure in the area. But the HOA was relentless. They fined me, sent more letters, threatened legal action. And every time I walked down to the pier, I started to wonder if I'd find a crew tearing it apart. I couldn't sleep. I was angry. Not just because of the pier, but because of the principle. How could someone else come in and take away something that had been here before they even arrived? Who gives them that right? Then one day, while going through some of my grandfather's old records, I found something. A land survey, an old one. It had been done when he bought the property, and it showed something interesting. The boundary line didn't stop where the HOA said it did. It actually extended into the water just a little, but enough. Enough to cover the base of the pier and a few feet beyond. In fact, it appeared that the pier wasn't even on HOA land. It was fully within the parcel my grandfather on Dan passed to me. That changed everything. I took that document to a property lawyer. He reviewed it carefully, ran the title records, and came back with a surprising answer. I not only owned the pier, I owned a small strip of shoreline that the HOA had been using for years. There was a walking trail right next to it, a trail maintained by the HOA benches. Even a little dock the HOA had installed 5 years ago for community kayaking events, and guess what? That dock? It sat partially on my land. They hadn't even asked permission. I had leverage now. Real legal standing, but I didn't act out of revenge. Not right away. I reached out to the HOA again, politely explained the findings, showed them the updated survey, and asked for the fines to be removed and the threats to stop. You'd think they would have apologized, thanked me for my patience, but no, they doubled down. Said they'd have their own legal team review the claim, and in the meantime, they warned me not to interfere with community property. They had no idea what was coming, because after a month of silence, I filed a formal complaint and request for rent. That's right, rent. For 5 years, the HOA had been using part of my land for their events, for their dock, their trail, their benches. I sent a bill. Nothing outrageous, just a fair market value estimate, a dollar figure backed by a land use consultant. And I attached a warning. If they didn't agree to negotiate, I'd be forced to restrict access. The community would lose access to the dock, the trail, and the shoreline, and they'd be facing a lawsuit for 5 years of unpaid land use. Suddenly, they were very interested in talking. Emails came in, calls, meetings. Their tone had changed. Gone was the cold indifference. Now it was polite, diplomatic. I wasn't interested in fighting anymore. I was tired. But I wanted fairness. I wanted them to acknowledge they were wrong. And most of all, I wanted to fish in peace, so we reached a deal. I kept my pier, they dropped the fines. And best of all, the HOA now pays me a small annual fee to keep their trail and dock where it is. It's not about the money. It's about the principle. They tried to take something from me, and in the end, they had to pay to keep using what was never theirs to begin with. Now, every morning, I sit at the end of that pier. coffee in hand, rod in the water. And sometimes, I see HOA members walk past on their trail, nodding politely. Some still look uncomfortable. That's fine, I don't need their approval. I have my peace, my pier, and a quiet little victory that reminds me some fights are worth standing your ground for. After the agreement was signed and things calmed down, you'd think the story ended there, but it didn't. The fallout from that little victory carried more weight than I expected. Word spread fast around the neighborhood. People who barely knew my name before were suddenly waving from across the street, stopping by to ask what really happened. Some thought I had sued the HOA and won a fortune. Others believed I must have had friends in high places. The truth, of course, was less dramatic, but the story had become something more. It was a symbol, a quiet reminder that sometimes the little guy can push back and win. I was never one for attention. I didn't want to be the neighborhood legend or the center of HOA gossip. But life has a way of putting you in positions you never asked for. A week after the deal, a neighbor came by with coffee and said, "You gave a lot of us hope." That hit me, because he wasn't talking about the pier. He was talking about the feeling, the frustration, the way the HOA had been handling things for years. Silent changes to bylaws, threatening letters, fines for grass being too long or sheds being too close to fences. My story had given others the courage to ask questions, to speak up, to say no when something didn't feel right. Soon, other residents started digging into their property records. I got emails asking about land surveys, old permits, how to talk to the county. Some of these people were elderly, or working 2 jobs, or raising kids they didn't have time or energy to fight, and the HOA knew that. But now, they had a little spark, a little push, and I realized that my fight had been about more than just the pier. It was about respect, about boundaries, literal and figurative. That's when I started getting invited to neighborhood meetings, not just as a member, but as a voice. Some even asked me to run for the board, but I politely declined. I didn't want politics. I wanted peace. Still, I showed up, listened, asked questions, and you'd be surprised how quickly things began to shift. People who had been silent for years started speaking up. The chairman, who once dismissed me with a cold stare, now made extra effort to greet me by name. The board meetings got longer, more transparent. Proposals that used to pass quietly were now debated openly. And while not everything changed overnight, the tone certainly did, but there were still consequences. Not everyone was thrilled. A few board loyalists called me difficult or troublemaker. They'd pass by my house without waving. One even left an anonymous note in my mailbox, calling me selfish for jeopardizing community harmony. I laughed when I read it, because if standing up for what's right makes you selfish, then I'll take that title with pride. The Pier, meanwhile, stood stronger than ever. I gave it a fresh coat of sealant, replaced a couple of boards, and added a small bench at the end. I even found an old photo of my grandfather sitting on that very Pearson hat tilted, a fishing rod in hand, and framed it in my living room, a reminder of where this all began. But the real turning point came a month later. It was just before sunset. I was sitting out on the pier, not fishing, just thinking, and I noticed a group of teenagers from the neighborhood walking along the shoreline trail. Normally, they'd pass by, maybe glance over, but this time, they stopped. One of them, a boy I'd seen around but never spoken to, walked up and asked, "Is it true you own this whole part?" I nodded. He smiled and said, "That's cool. My dad said you stood up to the HOA. That's kinda badass." Then he turned back to his friends and they kept walking. It was a small moment, but it meant something. Because kids don't usually care about legal battles or land disputes, but they know courage when they see it. That's when I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. It had become part of the neighborhood story. A moment people would remember, talk about, and maybe even learn from. The funny thing is, I never set out to teach anyone anything. I just wanted to protect a piece of my life, something that mattered. But now, it was helping others protect theirs. That's the power of standing up. It creates ripples, just like the ones that stretch out from the end of a pier when you drop a line into still water. A few weeks later, I got a letter, not from the HOA this time, but from a new neighbor who had just moved in. She wrote to say thank you, that she'd heard about the pier story from several neighbors, and that it gave her hope in choosing this community for her kids. She said it showed that people here cared enough to fight for what was right, and that gave her peace of mind. I read that letter twice. Then I folded it and placed it in the same folder that now held the land survey, the permit documents, and the rental agreement with the HOA. It's funny how something so simple, just a wooden pier, became the center of so much noise. But maybe it's never really about the pier. Maybe it's about holding on when everything around you tries to push you off center, about honoring the past while standing up in the present, about finding peace even in the middle of a storm. Now, when I sit on that bench at the end of the pier, it feels different. Not just like a quiet fishing spot, but like a place that stood its ground, that refused to vanish. And every time the wind carries the scent of the lake and the sun sets just right, I think about all the people who helped me, who stood with me, even silently. And I'm thankful, because in the end, I didn't just save the pier, I saved something bigger, a sense of belonging, a sense of place, a quiet kind of victory that speaks louder than any meeting ever could. A few months had passed. The seasons had started to change, and the trees along the lakefront took on that golden hue that always reminded me of my childhood. The pier, with its weathered wood and peaceful silence, had returned to being what it always was, a part of my everyday life. But even as things seemed calm on the surface, I knew that everything was different now. The balance of power in our neighborhood had quietly shifted. Not because of aggression, not because of shouting or lawsuits, but because one person said no at the right time, and it made all the difference. I started noticing things I hadn't before. Neighbors were planting gardens they once thought the HOA might disapprove of. One older couple, who used to stay completely quiet at meetings, began speaking up regularly, asking for fair treatment and accountability. A new family on the street invited me over for a barbecue, saying they were glad someone like me lived in the area because it gave them peace of mind. These weren't big events, they were small, steady signs of confidence growing in people. And honestly, that's the kind of win you don't always expect. It sneaks up on you quietly, like the fog rolling in over the lake in the early morning. I didn't ask for respect, but I started receiving it anyway. Even the board members who once dismissed me became more civil. One day, during a community cleanup event, the HOA president came over while we were collecting trash near the trail and said, "I underestimated you." It wasn't an apology, but in its own way, it was enough. Sometimes that's all you get tanned. Sometimes it's more than you think you need. That rental agreement, by the way, turned into a surprisingly important document. Every quarter, the HOA now sends a small rental payment for using the pier access in their marketing materials and shoreline maintenance plans. It's not a lot of money, nothing that'll change my life, but it's symbolic. That agreement says, this land is mine, and you can't erase that. It says that fairness isn't a threat. It's a foundation. Every now and then, someone new moves in and hears about the pier story. They usually come by and ask, "Is it true?" I just smile and say, "It's all true except the parts that got exaggerated by the neighborhood gossip." But even the exaggerations serve a purpose. They keep the story alive. They remind people that silence isn't always strength, that knowing your rights and standing your ground matters even if it's uncomfortable. I still fish off that pier, still sit out there on slow afternoons, watching the lake move and the wind ripple across the water. And every time I do, I remember what it took to keep it. Not just the paperwork or the meetings or the back and forth with the board, but the decision to not let something go just because someone said I should. There were days when it would have been easier to give up, to walk away, but I didn't, and that made all the difference. And now, as I sit there, I realize something else. This wasn't just a fight against a rule. It was a fight for something personal, for history, for memory, for connection. That pier was built with calloused hands, by people who didn't have much, but who understood the value of something real. And when someone tried to strip that away for convenience or control, it was up to me to remind them it doesn't work that way. The irony is, after all this time, the HOA has learned to work with me instead of against me. We've found a quiet middle ground. They've backed off from trying to micromanage personal spaces, and I've shown up more when the community needed help. Because despite our differences, we do live here together. And maybe, just maybe, they realized that keeping people happy doesn't mean controlling them. It means respecting them. The story of the pier is now part of the neighborhood's DNA. It gets brought up in board meetings, in neighborly chats, and sometimes even in welcome letters for new homeowners. Not because I asked for that, but because it became a point of pride for people who live here. A reminder that this place values fairness, voice, and community. And every so often, when someone says, "I heard you charge the HOA rent to use your pier," I grin and say, "Yep, and it was the best decision I ever made." So, what did I really gain? Sure, I got to keep my pier. Got a few dollars every quarter from a group that once wanted to bulldoze my history. But more importantly, I got a voice. I got respect. I got to help other people find theirs too. And in a world where it's easy to feel small, easy to feel like you don't matter, sometimes a small victory on the shoreline can be enough to remind you that you do. And when I look out at the water, with the pier stretching quietly into the lake, I don't just see wood and nails. I see a story. I see strength. I see a fight that didn't need fists, just facts and faith. I see proof that standing your ground, calmly and confidently, can change everything. Not just for you, but for everyone watching. Because that's the thing about stories like this. They don't just end. They echo.